continue in this
Mr. Chairman, will you direct the witness to answer that question?
You must answer the question. And that is to cause strife in the industry.
You're excused.
Chaos in the industry.
Will you direct the witness to answer that question, Mr. Chairman?
I told you before, I will answer this question
now, Mr.
fully.
Lieberman,
Your purpose is to use this to disrupt the motion picture industry, to invade the right not only of me, but of the producers to their thoughts, to their opinions.
This is a hearing room in Washington, D.C., where a congressional committee is investigating subversive acts in America. Officially named the House Committee on Un-American Activities, it has also been called the American Inquisition.
What my religious beliefs are, stand away from the stand.
The effect of its hearings can still be felt to this day. In 1947, 2 years after the victory over Nazi Germany, the United States was at war with itself, persecuting its own citizens in the name of anti-communism. It soon became a crusade that would reach its climax in the early 1950s with Senator Joseph McCarthy's televised hearings, in which State Department officials and even officers of the Army were recklessly charged with disloyalty. But before national television, there was an earlier Un-American Activities Committee, which had investigated teachers and doctors, labor leaders, Americans from all walks of life. In 1947, that committee turned its spotlight on Hollywood, questioning members of the motion picture industry about their politics and their patriotism. A defiant group of 10 men, writers, directors, and producers, refused to cooperate. They challenged the committee's right to probe their personal beliefs. They became known as the Hollywood 10. In the years that followed, a tidal wave of blacklisting swept through Hollywood, affecting hundreds of lives. This is a story about those years and some of the families that share the legacy of the Hollywood blacklist.
I am Sadie Ornitz, the wife of Samuel Ornitz, one of the Hollywood 10. I am speaking from memory, facing my 93rd birthday, and I look back on the years since and remember especially my husband's devotion to justice and high ethics.
Are you a member of the Screenwriters Guild?
I wish to reply to that question by saying that this involves a serious question of conscience for me.
Conscience?
Conscience, sir. Conscience. I say you do raise a serious question of conscience for me when you ask me to act in concert with you to override the Constitution.
Mr. Chairman,
wait a minute, let me answer the question.
Just a minute.
In asking me to violate the constitutional guarantee
Does not
of
violate the Constitution.
It does.
To answer a question.
The witness is through. Stand away.
I wish to repeat, Mr. Chairman.
Stand away from...
Conscience can be a hard taskmaster, exact a heavy price. The Hollywood 10 and many who later followed them before the committee would pay that price in lost careers and shattered lives. Today, many of those brought before the committee have died, but their stories continue on in their families and their shared commitment to a lifetime of political ideals and to the service of a conscience that still endures.
Mr. Scott, could you tell the committee whether or not you are now, have ever been a member of the Communist Party?
Mr. Stripling, that question is designed to inquire into my personal and private life. I don't think it is pertinent to this, I don't think it's a proper question either.
At that time, Adrian Scott was a very big figure in my eyes, a celebrity. He was considered one of the really bright, successful young stars of Hollywood. And when he made Crossfire, the first feature film on anti-Semitism in 1947, he represented everything that was important to me. And in the years that we went together, I never stopped viewing him as a hero.
Do you decline to answer the question, Mr. Scott?
I believe that question also invades my right as a citizen. I believe it also invades the First Amendment. I believe that I should not engage in any conspiracy with you to invade the First Amendment.
In 1947, the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC as it was called, began its investigation of communism in the motion picture industry. The committee, including Chairman J. Parnell Thomas and the young congressman from California, Richard M. Nixon, gained instant publicity for itself by calling up celebrities to testify and capitalizing on the public's never-ending fascination with Hollywood. First to be called before HUAC were well-known film stars, men like Robert Taylor, Ronald Reagan, Robert Montgomery, men who would not only bring widespread publicity to the hearings, but would answer the committee's questions in a friendly manner.
You believe, as a prominent person in your field, that it would be wise for us for the Congress to pass legislation to outlaw the Communist Party in the United States?
I think it would be a good idea, although I don't know, I have never read Karl Marx, and I don't know the basis of communism beyond what I've picked up from hearsay. What I've heard, I don't like it, because it isn't on the level.
If I had my way about it, they'd all be sent back to Russia or some other unpleasant place.
I would move to the state of Texas if it ever came here, because I think the Texans would kill them on sight.
Many studio moguls, fearing a financial loss, were also eager to cooperate with the committee. But the most damaging testimony was the actual naming of names.
Do you recall the names of any of the actors in the Guild who participate in such activities?
Well, the one chap I'm thinking of currently is Mr. Howard De Silva. Always seems to have something to say at the wrong time. Miss Karen Morley also usually appears at the Guild meetings.
That's K-A-R-E-N-M-O-R-L-E-Y?
I believe so, yes.
After the big stars and the studio bosses made their appearance, a group of lesser-known characters took center stage. 7 writers, 2 directors, and 1 producer were called before HUAC. They were to be questioned about membership in the Communist Party, a party which, by the way, had always been legal in the United States. The men agreed to close ranks and challenge the committee's right to invade their constitutional guarantees of freedom of belief and freedom of expression. These were the Hollywood 10.
Mr. Malt, are you a member of the Communist Party? Next, you are going to ask what my religious beliefs are, and you are going to insist before various members of the industry that since you don't like my religious beliefs, I should not work in that industry.
In that period, being a communist was talked about in the same breath as being a murderer. And I think that that attitude prevails today with millions of people in this country who a communist to them was a horrible creature. They had no notion of what a communist was or what communism stood for. I was involved, and my husband was involved in the progressive movement since the 1930s. During the Depression, I lived in the Bronx, and life was a terrible struggle, and I wasn't the only one. America was falling apart. Banks were closing, and people were starving, and there were men riding the rails in America, going from city to city looking for a job. The whole country was in ferment. They were angry, they were unemployed, and there was a lot of political activity that made a lot of sense. And that was my introduction to the progressive movement. And from then on, I was hooked.
I was a child of the Depression, and knew what it was to be on the bottom without much chance for education or any kind of comfortable life. And I remember at age 17 reading George Bernard Shaw's Intelligent Woman's Guide to Socialism, which sort of flipped me out. From that point on, I became a person who was very committed to political ideals, which for me meant the grapes of wrath concept, that you couldn't beat up people because they wanted to organize farm labors. You couldn't shoot people for being strike leaders. You had to give people a chance to earn a living, which didn't happen during the Depression. And that's all people wanted, was a chance, the dignity of work.
The test of our progress is not whether we add more to the abundance of those who have much. It is whether we provide enough for those who have too little.
I became educated in the progressive movement. I discovered my talents, which I had no notion that I had any. And I discovered, to my great surprise, that I was a pretty good organizer. And that's how I spent the next 20 years, raising money for the New Masses, the National Guardian, putting on concerts, plays. I kept working in the progressive movement constantly. I never stopped for a day.
We all had a dream. We had a dream of a better world for everybody.
It was a heyday, I would say, of good feeling about one's country, one's beliefs, and acting on those beliefs.
That made you feel alive, and it made you feel that you were working for a better world. And what was more important than that?
And I think we felt that we could accomplish a lot more than we actually were able to. But that doesn't keep us from trying. And it doesn't, none of us have really given up basically our point of view that the world is more perfectible than it is.
Each one of us, from being provincial, became internationally oriented. And our minds grew, our souls grew. We became much, much greater human beings in our interest in the international getting together of all peoples. In support of the Spanish loyalists from the heart of America, the people responded. I had formed the Hollywood Women's Council as a result of my work with the League for Peace and Democracy. I recall that there had been a collection of letters, stacks and stacks of them, in support of loyalist Spain. Will Rogers Jr. was on the platform at the Shrine Auditorium when we were waiting to send these letters. Will Rogers Jr. said, "The war has been lost." And the shock was like some kind of tremendous personal loss.
Only a few short years after the Spanish Civil War, the fight against fascism erupted into World War II. All America pulled together in the war effort, including Hollywood, which turned out a stream of patriotic films, many written by men who would later be called un-American. During World War II, the United States was allied with the Soviet Union, and the U.S. government praised the virtues of our Soviet ally.
Here in the village of Western Russia, behind the German lines of 6 months ago, the Russian people were burning their own farms. It is not only the Red Army that crushed the Germans on the Eastern Front. It's the courage of the Russian people.
In the final days of World War II, our coalition with the Soviet Union ended, and a Cold War of suspicion and mistrust began. At home, Americans dreamed of a new era of peace and prosperity. But all too soon, old disputes put aside during the war resurfaced. Even Hollywood was beset by problems as writers and studio technicians struggled to organize labor unions. Some politicians, intent on crushing labor militancy and dismantling the New Deal, used the Cold War and anti-communism as their springboard to power.
The communists have been, still are, and always will be a menace to freedom, to democratic ideals, to the worship of God, and to America's way of life.
This committee, under its mandate from the House of Representatives, has the responsibility of exposing and spotlighting subversive elements wherever they may exist. It is only to be expected that communists would strive desperately to gain entry to the motion picture industry, simply because the industry offers such a tremendous weapon for education and propaganda.
I think it was important to silence the communications business. There was nothing subversive in the content of the pictures. But they wanted to set the stage for the Cold War, and they really wanted to frighten the American people, and they did a masterful job in that direction.
Hollywood fights back.
This is Judy Garland. Have you been to a movie this week? You're going to a movie tonight, and maybe tomorrow? Look around the room. Are there any newspapers lying on the floor? Any magazines on your table? Any books on your shelves? It's always been your right to read or see anything you wanted to. But now it seems to be getting kind of complicated.
When the hearings took place in Washington, D.C., there was a groundswell of support in the Hollywood community for the 10. And a number of celebrities banded into a group called the Committee for the First Amendment. And some of these people were Humphrey Bogart, Lauren Bacall, Danny Kaye, Katharine Hepburn, Moss Hart, and these people went on a chartered flight to Washington to demonstrate support for the Hollywood 10. And I think in the context of the times, it was especially moving because it took courage to stand up at that time and risk identification with the Hollywood 10.
Well, I got involved with this whole Blacklist thing when Anatole Litvak called me up. He was a very well-known director who I knew professionally, and he asked me to go to a meeting at Ira Gershwin's house to discuss the situation in Washington that was going on. I felt very strongly, being an American, that America had really been founded by people who'd come over here because they wanted freedom of speech and freedom of thought. And so I was very, very enthusiastic about it. And I said yes, that I would go.
Well, when we went to Washington, they brought us in all together into the committee room. And J. Parnell Thomas, who went to jail, as you know, later, and he brought in John Howard Lawson to speak.
Are you a member of the Communist Party? Or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
The question of communism is in no way related to this inquiry, which is an attempt to get control of the screen and to invade the basic rights of American citizens in all fields, and citizens, whether they be Protestant or Methodist or Jewish.
John Howard Lawson was going to not answer, and Parnell Thomas knew it, so he started
banging that gavel. And louder and louder and louder. And you could not hear Lawson speaking. You just couldn't hear it.
We're going to get the answer to that question if we have to stay here for a week.
For the Bill of Rights, which was destroyed.
I was chilled by this. I was absolutely chilled. I was in the chamber of my government, and they were drowning out speech. It was frightening. I'll never forget as long as I live.
This is Humphrey Bogart. We sat in the committee room and heard it happen. We saw it and said to ourselves, it can happen here. We saw American citizens denied the right to speak by elected representatives of the people. We saw police take citizens from the stand like criminals after they'd been refused the right to defend themselves. We saw the gavel of a committee chairman cutting off the words of free Americans. The sound of that gavel, Mr. Thomas, rings across America. Because every time your gavel struck, it hit the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States.
All the motion picture people had gotten together. They could have stopped it, I think. Stopped the Washington investigation. They didn't. They were scared. I don't know why.
Well, I suppose the studios were frightened because when they're frightened, it always means money. It isn't patriotism, I don't think. I think they were afraid that that if there was a writer who had any kind of communist leanings, or if an actor was a communist, I'm afraid they felt that the public would stay away.
We will forthwith discharge or suspend without compensation those in our employ, and we will not re-employ any of the 10 until such time as he is acquitted or has purged himself of contempt and declares under oath that he is not a communist.
It wasn't long before the loyalty and patriotism of anyone who had shown support for the 10 was being called into question.
At that time in my career, I was, as they say, on a sort of a roll. I seemed to be getting all the parts in my particular bracket. I just played opposite Gary Cooper and Cary Grant, and I'd done a Golden Picture, all sorts of things. And then my agent called up one day and he said, I do not understand what's happening. You were up for 2 pictures. One you had, but the studio called this morning and said they'd changed their mind. Then that happened again and again. And then I began to think, what is in this thing? And a friend of mine who had nothing to do with this committee called me up and he said, Jane, I think you ought to know that you're on the list. I said, what list? He said, you're on the Red Channels list, the Blacklist. I said, oh, that's so silly. Well, I said, I'm not a communist. Everybody knows that. Then I couldn't get any jobs, so we just went to New York. Well, I think it put a sort of a stop on my film career. And I didn't come back till I did Father Knows Best.
I hated it here. I hated the atmosphere. I hated people losing jobs around me. All the people I liked had gone to Europe. So I went over and joined them.
While some did leave Hollywood, the 10 could not. They were engaged in an uphill legal battle against the rising tide of anti-communist sentiment. In 1950, their final options ran out. All 10 said goodbye to their families and left to serve 1-year terms in the federal penitentiary.
When my husband went to prison, I then devoted the rest of that year to talking to the community on all levels about the injustice, about the unfairness, and about the victims of hysteria. I believe that probably kept me going. They made a film on behalf of the Hollywood 10. And I recall that I spent my days with this film going to the community, going to the trade unions, going to all kinds of organizations in behalf of their fight.
The committee is now free to operate, to drag before it 1,000 people, or the million it boasts it has on its list. How are you going to answer the committee's questions?
Answer yes or no. Are you a member of the Communist Party, of the Progressive Party? Did you ever give $1 to Loyalist Spain?
When we were asked, are you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party, the committee was really preparing to ask you, are you now or have you ever been in favor of peace?
In Korea, the United States was now fully engaged in combat, no longer just a Cold War. Korea would be the first of a continuing series of clashes with the communist troops. In 1951, while the war raged on and the 10 were still in prison, HUAC began a second wave of hearings, both in Washington, D.C. and Hollywood. Over 100 people were called to testify. Like the 10, many refused to cooperate with the committee. Among this group were Agent George Wilner and screenwriter Michael Wilson. Ironically, Wilson's film, A Place in the Sun, had just become a hit at the box office and would win that year's Academy Award.
When Mike was called to testify, my husband's father argued with Mike that Mike should go ahead and testify because if he didn't, it would break his mother's heart. And that all he had to do was get up there and say that he was not a communist, and then everything would be fine, he said. And he couldn't understand why Mike wanted to be an uncooperative witness, and he never did understand why Mike was standing on principle, saying that they have no right to ask him questions about his politics.
We came to Hollywood in 1939, and he became a highly successful agent. And in 1950, he was called before the Un-American Activities Committee in Washington, and he refused to reveal who names or who his clients were or any of the other questions that were put to him by the committee. And he was therefore separated from his company. And that was the beginning of the Blacklist period for us.
But some of those called to testify did cooperate with the committee, talking about themselves and incriminating others. Writers like Martin Berkeley and Leo Townsend named literally hundreds of people.
Edward G. Robinson would fall in that category. 10 years ago or more, he started joining one communist front after another.
We knew in advance, in many cases, who was going to be called because it was pretty widely publicized. And normally, the stool pigeons would always make it a point of going to their best friends, the ones that they were going to inform on, and practically asking their permission and telling them in advance what they were going to do.
I remember the John Dos Passos, received John Dos Passos, one of our best American writers. John, J-O-H-N.
It was devastating for people among friends, to feel that someone that you'd been close to, that you'd cared for, loved, became an informer. It was almost unendurable. There were some people who took it better than others. Mike took it very, very hard when people that he had been very, very close to informed on him. He felt personally betrayed, and he felt that he could never ever have any contact with these people. And furthermore, this attitude of his remained throughout his entire life. He never really warmed up to the informers.
Actor Larry Parks, well known for supporting liberal causes, was called to testify in 1951. In an effort to avoid jail and save his career, he named names in a closed-door session with disastrous results.
Don't present me with the choice of either being in contempt of this committee and going to jail, or forcing me to crawl through the mud to be an informer. I beg you not to force me to do this.
It was a very difficult thing. Larry had made the decision, you see, to do what pleased nobody. It didn't please the committee, and it didn't please the people who had decided that the best